Welcome to the Tao at Night. Tonight we sit with a quiet teaching from the Tao Te Ching, known in the West as the Tao Te Ching. The teaching is this, that nothing essential is missing from this moment, and that the sense of lack so many of us carry through our days is not an accurate report of our circumstances, but an old habit of attention, reaching always toward what is next, rather than resting in what is already here. So much of life can feel like a quiet, persistent search for the achievement that will finally feel like enough, the relationship that will finally feel complete, the version of ourselves that will finally feel arrived. Now Tao pointed toward something gentler and stranger than all that searching. He suggested that completeness was never something to be acquired through effort or accumulation. It was the condition we kept quietly overlooking, simply because we were always looking past it, toward whatever seemed to wait further ahead. You do not need to know anything about Taoism to be here tonight. You only need to recognize a familiar feeling, the sense that something is still missing, no matter how much you accomplish, no matter how much you gather. That feeling is enough of a starting point. It is exactly where tonight's teaching begins. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is, where you are listening from, and whether you are a front, back, or side sleeper. There are no wrong answers here, only fellow travelers finding their way to rest. Across the chapters ahead, we will sit with this question from many different angles. A merchant searching the world for a treasure already in his own house, a woman convinced she has lost a ring she is still wearing, a gardener certain a flower has failed to bloom. Each chapter offers its own quiet doorway into the same recognition, that what we reach for is very often already here. So wherever you are right now, let yourself settle in. There is nothing to figure out. There is nowhere else to be. Thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night. Let us begin. Lao Tzu said that the sage does not go far to know much. He said the further one travels, the less one may actually understand. This sounds strange at first, because we are taught that understanding is something gathered from outside ourselves, collected like coins, hoarded like grain against a hard winter. But the Tao Te Ching points somewhere quieter. It suggests that what we are searching for through all that travel is not, in fact, elsewhere. The treasure is not on the far road. It is not in the next city, the next achievement, the next version of ourselves we imagine waiting up ahead. It is here, in the house we already live in the breath we are already taking. Most searching is simply motion away from the very thing being sought. There was once a merchant who lived in a house with 3 courtyards, and in the innermost courtyard there was a room that no one but he ever entered. He had built this room himself, brick by brick, many years before, to hold the treasure he was certain he would someday find. He had heard, as a young man, that somewhere in the world there existed a jewel of such perfect clarity that whoever held it would never again feel the ache of incompleteness. He did not know who had told him this. He only knew that he believed it utterly, the way a person believes the sun will rise. So he left his house and he traveled to the western mountains, where traders spoke of a jewel kept by monks in a monastery so high that clouds passed beneath its windows. He climbed for many days. When he arrived, The monks showed him their finest stone, a piece of jade smooth as a held breath. He turned it in his palm for a long while. It was beautiful, but it was not the one. He felt this the way a man feels a coat that almost fits, close enough to ache, not close enough to keep. He travelled south to the river kingdoms, where it was said a queen possessed a pearl pulled from the belly of a sea creature no one had seen since. He bribed his way into her court. She showed him the pearl, pale as morning. He held it under lamplight, turned it, watched it catch the flame. Still not the one. He travelled east, across a desert that took the skin off his lips and the certainty out of his stride, to a city built entirely of red stone, where merchants whispered of a ruby with a fire trapped inside it, a fire that once seen could never be forgotten. He found the ruby. He held it. He felt, for one trembling moment, that this might finally be it. And then the moment passed, the way all such moments had passed before, and the stone was simply a stone again, lovely and inert in his hand. In the years between these journeys, he passed through countless smaller towns, and in each one he asked the same questions of strangers. Had they seen a jewel of perfect clarity? Had they heard tales of a stone that ended longing? Most shook their heads. A few told him stories that led nowhere, rumours that dissolved the moment he arrived to test them. One innkeeper told him of a sapphire kept by a hermit in the northern hills, and he climbed for a week only to find the hermit had died years before, his hut collapsed, his belongings scattered to weather and animals. He stood in the ruin of that hut for a long time, feeling something he did not yet have words for, not grief exactly, but a kind of tiredness that went deeper than his legs. 20 years went by this way. His beard turned the colour of ash. His knees complained on stairs they had once taken 2 at a time. His hands, which had once gripped a merchant's ledger with quick confidence, now moved more slowly, as though they had learned something his mind had not yet caught up to. His house, with its 3 courtyards and its locked inner room, sat empty behind him in a city he barely remembered the smell of. Eventually, exhausted in a way that had stopped being only physical, he found his way to a small dwelling at the edge of a forest, where an old woman was known to take in travellers who had run out of road. He did not ask her for wisdom. He only asked for a place to rest his feet. She gave him tea and watched him drink it, and after a long while she asked him what he had been searching for, since it was clear from his face that he was a man who had been searching for a great while. He told her about the jewel, the clarity, the promise that it would end the ache. She nodded slowly, the way a person nods at a story they have already heard many times in many different mouths. "Tell me," she said, "what is in the innermost room of your house?" He frowned. "Nothing. I built it for the jewel before I had found it. It has sat empty all these years, waiting." "And in 20 years," she said, "did anyone enter that room?" "No," he said. "I locked it. I was saving it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled the way someone smiles at a child who has hidden their own shoes and then wept for losing them. "What if," she said, "the room was never empty because the jewel had not arrived? What if the room was empty because you kept it sealed against the very thing you wanted it to hold? He did not understand her at first. He asked her to explain further. You built a space for completeness, she said, and then you went looking for completeness somewhere else, leaving the space dark and locked the entire time. Perhaps it is not the jewel that was missing. Perhaps it was only the door. He sat with this for 3 days at her hearth, saying very little, turning the thought the way he had once turned jade and pearl and ruby in his hands. On the 4th morning he thanked her, and began the long walk home, not searching this time, simply walking, the way a man walks towards something familiar rather than away from something feared. When he reached his house, dust thick on every surface, he went straight to the innermost room and unlocked the door for the first time in 20 years. Morning light came through the high window and fell across the bare floor, and dust turned slowly in the light like something dancing. He stood in the doorway a long time. There was no jewel there. There never had been. But he found, standing in that small, bright room that he had sealed away for 2 decades, waiting for something to deserve it, that the ache he had carried across 3 countries and 1 desert had gone strangely quiet. Not because he had found what he was looking for, but because for the first time he had stopped reaching past the room to look for it. He never did find the jewel he had set out for. He lived many more years in that house, and visitors sometimes asked him about his travels, and he would tell them honestly that he had seen mountains and rivers and a city of red stone, and that none of it had given him what he came home to find sitting quietly in an empty room with the door finally open. In Sufi poetry, there is a similar understanding, carried for centuries in verse and story, long before it reached the page. The poets often wrote of a traveller searching the world for the beloved, only to discover that the beloved had been travelling inside the traveller's own chest the entire time, closer than the search, closer than the longing itself. Rumi told of a man who wept at the door of his own house, having returned from far countries, only to be asked by a voice within, "Why are you weeping outside a house you have never actually left?" The Sufi poets also spoke of the reed cut from the reed bed, crying out in its flute music because it remembers being whole, remembers being part of something it was not separate from. The crying, they said, is not proof of absence. It is proof of a memory the reed cannot quite silence, however far it travels from the bed it was cut from. This points to the same recognition Lao Tao offered, that searching, however sincere, can itself become the very thing standing between the seeker and the sought. The 2 traditions, born in different deserts and different centuries, arrive at the same quiet doorway. You may recognize something of the merchant in your own life. Perhaps you have told yourself that a different job would finally settle the unrest you carry, that once you reach some particular title, some particular income, the ache would stop asking questions of you. Or perhaps it is a relationship you imagine, some future companionship that would complete what feels unfinished tonight. Look closely, though, at what is actually missing right now, in this room, in this bed. Often the answer is far smaller than the story you have been telling. The job may come, the companionship may come, but the ache that sent you looking rarely waits for either, because it was never really about the destination. It was about a door you forgot you could open from where you already stood. Tonight, you do not need to travel anywhere. You do not need to find the jewel. You can simply notice the room you are already in, this bed, this quiet, this breath, and let it be enough, the way the merchant's empty room was, eventually, enough. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching in the Tao Te Ching that the way cannot be told, only lived, and that those who speak of it most confidently often understand it least. This is not a riddle meant to confuse. It is a kindness, pointing toward something that words can only gesture at, never fully hold. Many spend years searching for a teacher who will hand them the missing piece, the explanation that finally makes everything click into place. But the deepest instruction Lao Da suggested was never far away enough to require a long journey. It was breathing in your chest before you ever set out to look for it. The teacher you seek may only be pointing you back towards something you already carry and have simply stopped noticing because it never once left. There was once a young monk who lived in a small mountain temple, tending goats and sweeping stone paths, who became convinced that true understanding lay somewhere far beyond his own valley. He had read in an old scroll left behind by a traveling scholar of a teacher who lived many months' journey to the north in a temple so remote that few who set out to find it ever returned to say whether they had succeeded. He told his master he wished to leave. His master, an old woman with hands like dried river reeds, did not try to stop him. She only asked him to sit with her one final evening before he left, and to simply breathe the way he had been taught as a boy, in and out, slow and unhurried, while she said nothing at all. He sat, he breathed, the fire popped, an owl called somewhere in the dark beyond the windows. After a long while, she asked him a single question. "What are you breathing right now?" He did not understand. "Air," he said, "the same air as always." "And when you reach the northern temple," she said, "after all those months of walking, what would you breathe there?" He paused. "Air," he admitted. "I suppose the same." She smiled, but said nothing further, and the next morning he left anyway, because a young man convinced of his own lack rarely abandons the journey on the strength of one riddle by a fire. He walked for months. He crossed 2 rivers by raft, and one by a bridge so old it swayed beneath his feet like something alive. He slept in barns, in the homes of strangers, once in the open beneath a sky so full of stars that he wept without entirely understanding why. Along the way, he met other travelers also searching for something. A healer chasing a cure rumored to grow only on one particular mountainside. A poet chasing a teacher who could supposedly grant the perfect turn of phrase. a merchant's son chasing a fortune he believed waited for him in a city he had never seen. Each of them spoke with the same fevered certainty he recognized in his own chest, and he found himself wondering more than once around their shared fires whether they were all walking away from something rather than toward it, though he could not yet have said what that something was. He arrived, finally, thinner and sun-darkened, at the northern temple, where an ancient teacher was said to hold instructions that could end a seeker's restlessness forever. The teacher received him kindly. He was an old man, smaller than the monk had imagined, with eyes that seemed to take in everything and demand nothing. "I have come a long way," the young monk said, "because I am missing something. I feel it always, like a held breath I cannot release. I believe you can teach me what it is." The old teacher considered him for a long moment. "Sit," he said. "Breathe." The young monk sat. He breathed. It felt at first like nothing at all, the very instruction his own master had given him before he left, the very instruction he had carried across 2 rivers and 1 swaying bridge to escape. "This is the same as where I began," he said, more sharply than he intended. "I came all this way for this." "What did you expect to find?" the teacher asked. "Something more," the young monk said. "Something I did not already have." The old teacher was quiet for a while, watching the young monk's chest rise and fall. "Tell me," he said eventually, "in all your months of walking, was there a single breath that was not enough to keep you alive?" The young monk frowned, turning the question over. "No," he admitted. "Every breath was enough. That is rather the nature of breathing." "And yet you walked all this way," the teacher said, "believing that somewhere ahead a different breath was waiting, one that would finally be enough in some deeper way than all the others." The young monk said nothing. Something in his chest had gone very still, the way a pond stills once the wind that troubled it has passed. "I am not going to teach you to breathe differently," the old teacher said. "I could not, even if I wished to. I am only going to ask you to notice that you already know how, and that you have always known, and that no temple, north or south, was ever going to change that fact. The teaching you were searching for was never separate from the searching itself. It was the breath beneath the search." The young monk sat with this a long while before speaking again. "Then why did you let me sit here all this time?" he asked. "If you knew from the moment I arrived that you had nothing new to give me." "Because you needed to arrive somewhere," the teacher said, "before you could believe that arriving and staying were the same thing. If I had told you this at your own gate, in your own valley, you would have thought it was simply an old woman being kind to a restless boy. You needed the rivers. You needed the bridge that swayed, not because they taught you anything new, but because they wore down the part of you that could not yet hear it. That seems like a great deal of walking for a lesson that could have been spoken in a single sentence," the young monk said, and there was no bitterness in it now, only something closer to wonder. "Most lessons worth keeping are like that," the old teacher said. "A single sentence and a lifetime to actually hear it." The young monk stayed at the northern temple through 1 full winter, mostly in silence, mostly simply breathing in the old teacher's quiet company. When the thaw came, he decided to walk home, not because he had failed to learn what he came for, but because he understood, finally, that his own valley held exactly the same air, the same breath, the same teaching he had crossed 2 rivers searching for elsewhere. When he returned, his old master was still alive, still tending goats, her hands no less like dried river reeds than before. She did not ask him what he had learned. She only handed him a broom and gestured toward the stone path, and he swept it the way he always had, breathing the same breath he had always breathed, understanding now that this had been the whole of the teaching from the very beginning. Years later, when he himself had grown old and other young monks came to him restless with the same fever to travel far in search of answers, he did not forbid them from leaving. He only asked each of them before they set out to sit with him one evening and simply breathe, the way his own master had once asked him. Some left anyway. Most of those came back eventually, the way he had, having walked a great distance to discover a door that had been standing open behind them the entire time. In Lakota tradition, there is a similar understanding carried in the phrase "mitaku ye o yasin," all my relations, a recognition that nothing stands separate from the great hoop of existence, that a person is never missing connection to the world because that connection was never broken in the first place, only forgotten in moments of fear or isolation. Elders have taught that the 4 directions, the seasons, the breath of animals and humans alike are not things to be acquired or earned. They are already given, already present, woven into a person from before their first cry. There is also a teaching carried among Lakota storytellers about the pipe carrier who is told that the sacred pipe does not create the connection between the people and the greater mystery. It simply makes visible a connection that was there all along, the way a window does not create the sky, but only lets it be seen more clearly. This mirrors the monk's discovery precisely, that the long search for a teaching beyond the self was, from the very start, simply a search for clearer eyes to see what had never actually been hidden, only overlooked in the noise of looking elsewhere. You may know this restlessness yourself, the sense that some workshop, some retreat, some book not yet read holds the missing piece of your own understanding. Perhaps you have collected courses you never finished, or notebooks of advice you meant to apply someday, certain that the next one would finally be the one that changes things. Or perhaps it shows up smaller in the quiet suspicion that other people have figured out something about living that you have not yet been told. Look for a moment at your own breath right now, here in this bed. It does not require a northern temple. It does not require a teacher's permission. It has been sufficient every single time you have used it your entire life, without exception. Tonight, you do not need new instruction. You only need to notice the old one, breathing quietly in your chest, exactly as it always has, asking nothing further of you than to be noticed and trusted as you drift towards sleep. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching speaks often of returning to the root, suggesting that what we search for has never actually departed, only become harder to notice beneath the noise of searching. Lauder taught that the 10,000 things rise and fall, busy and various, and yet each one returns, eventually, to the same quiet origin it never truly left. There is something almost comic in how often we mourn the loss of a thing still resting in our own hand, still folded into our own life, simply because our attention has wandered elsewhere, looking for it. The mind, fixed on absence, becomes blind to presence, even when presence is sitting in plain view, warm and familiar, waiting only to be noticed again. There was once a woman who lived in a fishing village, known for her skill at mending nets and for the silver ring she wore on her left hand, a ring given to her by her grandmother on the day she was born, etched with a pattern of waves that her grandmother had said would always lead her back home, no matter how far she travelled. One autumn, after a long season of storms had damaged the boats and frightened away the fish, she became convinced that the ring was gone. She remembered touching it that morning. She was certain of this, and yet now, hours later, mending nets by lamplight, her hand felt bare to her, and a cold feeling rose in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She searched her house first, turning over baskets, shaking out blankets, running her fingers along the cracks in the floorboards where small things sometimes fell. She searched the path to the shore, bent low with a lamp, certain she would see a glint of silver in the sand. She searched the boats, the nets themselves, the pockets of every coat she owned. She did not find it. She asked her neighbors whether they had seen it, and they searched too, kindly, holding their own lamps low along the same path she had already walked twice. She went, finally, to an old fisherman who lived at the edge of the village, a man known for noticing things others missed. The turn of weather before it arrived, the mood of the sea before it showed itself in waves. "I have lost my grandmother's ring," she told him, and her voice shook in a way that surprised her, because she had told herself all day that it was only a ring, only metal. And yet the loss felt larger than that, as though something essential about herself had gone missing along with it. The old fisherman looked at her for a long moment, the way he might look at the horizon before deciding whether a storm was truly coming or only threatening to. "When did you last feel it?" he asked. "This morning," she said. "I am certain. I remember the weight of it as I tied my hair back. And since then, I have searched everywhere," she said. "The house, the shore, the boats. My neighbors have searched too and found nothing." "Have you searched your hand?" he asked. She looked down, almost without meaning to, the way a person glances at a clock they already know the time on. The ring was there. It had been there the entire time, on her left hand, exactly where it always sat, where it had sat every day since her grandmother placed it there. She had simply stopped feeling it, the way a person stops feeling their own shoes after enough hours of walking, the way familiar weight becomes invisible weight. She laughed, but it was not an easy laugh. There was something unsettled in it. "How could I have searched the entire shore," she said, "and not thought to look at my own hand?" "Because you were searching for an absence," the old fisherman said, "not a presence. Once the mind decides something is gone, it becomes very good at finding evidence for that belief and very poor at noticing evidence against it. You searched the sand because the sand fit the story you had already decided was true. Your hand did not fit the story, so your eyes passed over it without truly seeing. "But I felt its absence," she said. "That was not imagined. My hand truly did feel bare to me." "I believe you," the old fisherman said. "The feeling was real. It is only the conclusion drawn from the feeling that was mistaken. A bare feeling does not always mean a bare hand. Sometimes it only means an unattended one. You had stopped noticing the ring the way you stopped noticing your own breathing, and the moment you stopped noticing it, your mind quietly filled the gap with a story of loss, because a story of loss is easier to hold than the simple truth of inattention." "That seems a strange trick for a mind to play on itself," she said. "It is a very old trick," he said, "and not only with rings." She sat with him a while longer, turning the ring slowly on her finger, feeling its familiar weight return to her awareness, the way warmth returns to fingers that have been out in the cold. "It frightens me a little," she admitted, "to think how easily I convinced myself of something so wrong. If I could be so certain about a ring on my own hand, what else have I convinced myself was missing when it was here the entire time?" The old fisherman considered this. "That," he said, "is usually the more important question. The ring was easy to recheck. You only had to look down. Most other things we believe are missing: a sense of enough, a feeling of being loved, a quiet kind of peace. Those do not announce themselves as plainly as silver-catching lamplight. They sit just as visibly on us as that ring sat on your hand, and yet we search the whole shore for them anyway, because the story of their absence has already taken hold, and stories, once believed, are slow to release their grip." She walked home slowly that night, the ring cool and solid beneath her fingers whenever she touched it, testing it almost, the way a person tests a held breath after being told they had stopped breathing and had not noticed. She thought of all the other things she had spent years searching for elsewhere, a sense of having done enough with her life, a feeling that she was loved adequately by the people around her, a quiet conviction that her days amounted to something worth the living of them. She wondered, walking home under a sky just beginning to clear after the long storms, how many of those things had also been resting quietly on her the entire time, waiting only to be felt rather than found, the way the ring had waited, patient and unmoving, through an entire day of frantic searching. In the years that followed, whenever she felt that old, cold feeling rise in her chest, the sense that something essential had slipped away from her unnoticed, she learned to pause before searching the shore. She learned to look first at her own hand, her own breath, her own day, before believing the story that something necessary had gone missing from it. In Stoic philosophy, there is a similar understanding, carried in the writings of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who taught that much of human suffering comes not from circumstance itself, but from judgment laid over circumstance. The story told about a thing, rather than the thing as it actually is. Epictetus often pointed out that people are disturbed not by events, but by their opinions about events, and that a great deal of felt lack comes from exactly this kind of misplaced opinion, a conviction of absence laid over a reality that, examined plainly, contains no such absence at all. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately to himself, often returned to the practice of looking directly at what was actually present in a moment, stripped of the dramatic narrative the mind likes to add. He would remind himself that he possessed, right now, exactly what he needed to meet this hour with steadiness. not more, not less. This mirrors the fisherman's gentle correction precisely, the call to check the hand rather than search the shore, to examine the present plainly before accepting the story the frightened mind has already written about what it lacks. Both traditions suggest the same quiet discipline, returning again and again to what is actually here, rather than trusting the persuasive but often inaccurate verdict of an anxious imagination. You may carry a version of this same conviction tonight, a sense that something essential is missing from your life, even though, examined plainly, the evidence for that absence is thinner than it feels. Perhaps you believe you lack purpose, while in fact you have simply stopped noticing the small, steady ways your days already matter to someone. Perhaps you believe you lack rest, while overlooking the rest already available to you in this very bed, in this very breath, right now. Like the woman searching the shore for a ring already on her hand, you may be searching the wrong places for something that has not actually gone anywhere. Tonight, rather than thinking your way through the question of what might be missing, simply feel your way through it instead. Notice your hand resting somewhere on the blanket. Notice your breath continuing, steady, unbothered by any story. Let that noticing be enough, the way the woman's noticing was enough, the moment she finally looked down and found exactly what she had been carrying the entire time. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lauder warned against comparison, the habit of measuring one's own life against another's and finding it wanting by the comparison alone, regardless of what is actually held. The Tao Te Ching suggests that the sage does not compete, because competing requires believing in scarcity, and scarcity is very often a story laid over a world that is in fact sufficient. A full barn can look empty beside the idea of someone else's fuller one. A quiet life can look lacking beside the imagined splendor of a neighbor's, even when that splendor exists mostly in the comparing mind, rather than in the neighbor's actual days. What is enough has nothing to do with what someone else has. It has only to do with what is actually present, examined honestly, without another person's harvest laid over it like a measuring stick that was never meant for this field. There was once a farmer whose barn was full at the end of every harvest, grain stacked to the rafters, enough to feed his family and his animals through even the hardest winter, with surplus left over to trade in the spring. By any honest measure, he wanted for nothing. And yet every evening he stood at his fence and looked across the low stone wall to his neighbor's land and felt a familiar tightness rise in his chest, because his neighbor's harvest from where he stood always seemed somehow fuller. The stacks looked higher. The grain looked richer in color. He could not have said exactly why he believed this, only that he believed it with the same unquestioned certainty with which he believed the sun would set behind the western hills each evening. He began visiting his neighbor more often, on small pretexts, borrowing tools he did not need, asking after the health of livestock he had no real interest in, all so that he might glance just briefly into the other man's barn. Each time he came away more convinced that his own harvest was somehow lesser, though he could never quite explain, when pressed, exactly what the difference was. One evening, an old travelling grain merchant stopped at his farm seeking shelter for the night, and the farmer, restless as always, found himself telling the merchant the whole of his trouble. The tightness at the fence, the visits on false pretenses, the conviction that grew with each passing season that his own barn, however full, was simply not full enough. The merchant listened without interrupting, the way a person listens who has heard a similar story many times before in many different mouths. "Would you show me your barn?" the merchant asked when the farmer had finished. The farmer led him out by lamplight. The merchant walked the length of it slowly, running his hand along the stacked grain, lifting handfuls and letting them fall back through his fingers, testing the weight and the dryness of it. "This is a fine harvest," the merchant said, "as fine as any I have seen this season, in either direction along the road I travelled to reach you. But my neighbour's is fuller," the farmer said. "Have you measured it?" the merchant asked. "Stack against stack, weight against weight?" The farmer admitted he had not. He had only looked. "Then would you walk with me to his barn," the merchant said, "so that we might measure together rather than simply look?" The farmer agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and the two of them walked the low stone wall in the dark to the neighbour's farm, where the neighbour, a kind man, if a little puzzled by the late visit, agreed to let them into his barn as well. The merchant walked this barn the same way, slow and thorough, lifting grain, testing weight, running careful hands along every stack. When he had finished, he led the farmer back out into the night air. "Well?" the farmer asked. "Whose is fuller, yours?" the merchant said simply, "by a measure small enough that no honest eye could have told the difference from across a fence in the evening light. The conviction you have been carrying these many seasons was not built from anything your own eyes actually saw. It was built from a feeling that arrived first and then went looking for a barn to attach itself to." The farmer was quiet for a long moment. "Then what was I looking at all those evenings at the fence?" "You were looking at his barn," the merchant said, "but you were seeing your own fear. The eye does not measure honestly when the heart has already decided what it expects to find. You expected to find lack, so lack is what your eyes obediently reported back to you, regardless of what was actually stacked in front of them." "But why would my heart decide such a thing?" the farmer asked, "when my own barn has never once failed to see my family through winter?" The merchant considered this for a while before answering. "Perhaps," he said, "because a full barn is a quiet kind of safety, and quiet safety does not announce itself the way danger does. Lack is loud. It demands attention. Sufficiency, by comparison, asks for nothing, and so the mind, which is built to notice demands, walks right past it without a second glance, then turns to the fence looking for something louder to worry about instead." The farmer returned home that night and stood again at his own barn door, looking in by lamplight at the same grain he had looked at 100 times before without truly seeing it. He counted nothing, he measured nothing, he simply stood, the way the merchant had stood in his neighbour's barn, hand resting against a stack of grain that had been sufficient every winter of his life, without exception. He found, standing there, that the tightness in his chest had eased, not because anything in the barn had changed, but because he had finally looked at it plainly, without his neighbor's wall standing invisibly between his eyes and what was actually his. He still glanced toward the neighboring farm sometimes, in the years that followed, old habits being slow to fully release their hold. But he found more and more often that the glance no longer carried the old tightness with it. He had measured once, honestly, with another man's careful hands beside his own, and the measuring had stayed with him longer than the looking ever had. Years later, when his own son stood at that same fence one evening with the same tight, unsettled look, the farmer led him inside instead by lamplight, and had him run his hands along their own stacked grain the way the old merchant once had, lifting it, feeling its weight, testing it for himself, rather than trusting only his eyes from a distance. "It is fuller than I thought," the boy said finally. "It generally is," the farmer told him. "That is usually the first thing the fence steals from a person, not the grain itself, but the simple willingness to go and check." In Hindu philosophy, there is a similar understanding carried in the teaching of Santosha, contentment, named among the foundational disciplines in the yoga tradition as a practice rather than a mood that simply arrives or fails to. The texts describe Santosha as an active cultivation of sufficiency, a deliberate turning of attention toward what is present rather than what is imagined to be lacking by comparison to another's portion. There is also the teaching of Maya, the veil of illusion that causes a person to perceive separation and scarcity, where beneath the veil only wholeness exists. The farmer's fence in this light can be understood as exactly such a veil, a thin, almost invisible line in the eye that nonetheless convinces the mind it is staring across an immense, unbridgeable distance of fortune. Hindu teachers have long suggested that lifting this veil does not require acquiring anything new. It requires only a clearer kind of seeing, the same clearer seeing the grain merchant offered the farmer with nothing more than a patient hand and an honest measure. You likely know this fence yourself, even if your version of it has nothing to do with grain. Perhaps it is a colleague's career that always seems to be advancing faster than your own, even though, measured honestly, your own steady progress has never once failed to provide for what you actually need. Perhaps it is a friend's relationship, their travels, their home, glimpsed only from the outside, in the evening light, where everything tends to look fuller than it would up close. Notice, tonight, that you are not actually required to measure your life against anyone else's barn. You are only required to measure it honestly against itself, against what it has actually provided you season after season without failure. Let your attention rest, just for a moment, on what is sufficient in your own life right now, in this bed, in this breath, the way the farmer finally let his hand rest against his own grain, full and warm and entirely enough. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching teaches that the great sound is rarely heard, that what is most complete often announces itself so quietly it is mistaken for nothing at all. Lao Tzu pointed toward the silence that exists before any note is played, suggesting that this silence is not empty in the way a missing thing is empty, but full in a way that has not yet been given form. Musicians often search a lifetime for the perfect sound, the note that will finally satisfy something restless in them, without noticing that the stillness preceding every note they have ever played already held everything that note could only partially express. The reaching for the next sound can become, without anyone intending it, a quiet refusal of the fullness already present in the pause. There was once a musician who played a stringed instrument with such skill that people travelled from neighbouring villages to hear her, and yet she herself remained unsatisfied, certain that somewhere among the countless notes available to her there existed one she had not yet found, a note so perfectly suited to some ache in her chest that playing it would finally still the restlessness she had carried since childhood. She practiced for hours each day, trying new combinations, new tunings, new ways of striking the strings, listening always for that one note, the way a person listens for a particular voice in a crowded market, certain they will recognize it the instant they hear it. She travelled, in the years before she came to study with her teacher, to hear other musicians who were said to have found something close to it. She heard a flute player in a mountain village whose breath seemed to carry an entire valley's worth of longing in a single sustained tone. She heard a drummer in a river town whose rhythm made grown men weep without any of them being able to say why. Each performance moved her, briefly, the way the jade and pearl had briefly moved the merchant of an earlier story, and each time, within days, the old restlessness returned, convincing her that the note she truly needed still lay somewhere ahead, unplayed. Her teacher, an old man who had taught her since she was a girl and who rarely commented on her playing any more, watched her search grow more and more frantic over the seasons, her playing sharper but somehow less settled, as though she were always reaching past the music itself toward something just beyond it. One evening, after she had played for him without stopping for nearly an hour, trying combination after combination with growing frustration, he asked her to set the instrument down. "I am not finished," she said. "I have not found it yet." "Found what?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The note," she said. "The one that will finally be enough. I know it exists. I have almost touched it several times in passing and then lost it again before I could hold on to it properly." He nodded slowly, the way a person nods who has heard a similar conviction many times before, in many different students, across many different years. "Play nothing," he said, "for a moment. Simply hold the instrument and listen." She frowned, but did as he asked, lowering her hands from the strings, the room settling into a quiet that felt, to her restless ears, almost unbearable. "What do you hear?" he asked after a while. "Nothing," she said. Silence. "Listen again," he said. More carefully, she closed her eyes. She heard, after a moment, the small sounds beneath the silence, the settling of the house, the wind moving along the eaves outside, her own breath, the faint creak of the instrument's wood adjusting to the evening cool. "It is not truly empty," she admitted. "There is something in it, many small things, "And before you play your very first note tomorrow morning," he said, "where will that fullness be?" "Here," she said slowly, "still here, waiting." "And the note you have been chasing for years," he said, "where do you imagine it exists before your hand ever touches a string?" She did not answer immediately. She sat with the question, her hands still resting on the strings without pressing them. "I suppose," she said eventually, "it would have to come from this same silence. There is nowhere else for it to come from." "Then perhaps," her teacher said, "the note you are searching for has never actually been ahead of you, waiting to be discovered through enough searching. Perhaps it has always been behind every note you have ever played, in the same fullness you just noticed in this silence. Every sound you make is simply this silence briefly given shape. The shape changes, the fullness underneath it does not." "But if that is true," she said, somewhat troubled by the thought, "then why does the restlessness never stop? Why do I still feel, even now, as though something is missing?" Her teacher considered this carefully before answering. "Because you have spent so many years training your attention to chase the shape," he said, "that you have nearly forgotten how to notice the fullness underneath it. The restlessness is not proof that something is missing. It is only proof of habit, a very old habit of looking past what is here in favor of what might be here next." She sat for a long while after that, not playing, simply holding the instrument and listening to the small sounds beneath the silence, the settling house, the wind, her own unhurried breath. She found, as the evening went on, that the silence began to feel less like an absence waiting to be filled, and more like a kind of company, steady and unbothered, asking nothing of her. When she finally did play again, much later that night, it was not in search of any particular note. She simply let her hands move, and the notes arrived the way breath arrives, unforced, each one rising out of the same silence and settling back into it when it had finished, the way a wave rises from the sea and returns to it without ever truly having left. She did not stop playing in the years that followed, but she noticed more and more that the searching quality had gone out of it. She played the way a person breathes, not reaching for some perfect breath still ahead of them, but trusting the ordinary one already moving through their chest. Some years later, a young student came to her, much as she had once gone to her own teacher, certain that some perfect note still waited undiscovered somewhere in the strings. She listened to the young woman's frantic playing for a while, recognizing the old reaching quality in it, the same quality she had once carried herself. "You are listening past the silence," she told the young woman, "the same way I once did, for years longer than I would like to admit." "How do I stop?" the student asked. "I have tried. The reaching only seems to grow stronger the harder I try to release it." "You do not stop by trying to stop," she said. "You stop by setting the instrument down, just for a while, and listening to what was already there before you ever picked it up." The student set the instrument down, reluctantly, and the two of them sat together in the quiet room, listening to the same small sounds beneath silence that her own teacher had once pointed her toward: the settling house, the wind, the unhurried breath moving in and out of two chests instead of one. "I do not hear anything special," the student admitted after a while. "That is exactly right," she said, smiling. "There is nothing special to hear. There is only everything, arriving quietly, the way it always has. In Buddhist teaching, there is a similar understanding carried in the concept of shunyata, often translated as emptiness, though this translation can mislead a listener into imagining a hollow absence rather than what the teaching actually points toward: a spacious fullness not yet fixed into any single form. The Heart Sutra teaches that form is not separate from this emptiness, and emptiness is not separate from form, the two arising together the way sound arises from silence without ever truly departing from it. There is also the teaching of the present moment as already complete, found throughout the Zen-adjacent strands of Buddhist practice, which encourage a practitioner to stop reaching towards some imagined future state of peace and instead notice the peace already available in this single breath, this single sound, this single silence before the next note begins. Both teachings mirror the musician's discovery precisely, that the fullness she sought through endless searching was never separate from the silence she had been impatiently waiting to fill. You may recognize this same restless reaching in your own life, perhaps in the way you chase the next milestone, certain that this next one, unlike all the others before it, will finally settle something in your chest. A promotion, a renovated home, a body that finally looks the way you have been told it should. Each one arrives, and the old restlessness quietly resumes its search, the way the musician's hands kept reaching for one more combination of notes. Notice tonight the silence beneath your own thoughts, the way the musician noticed it beneath her instrument. It has been here the entire time, holding everything you have ever felt or played or chased, asking nothing of you in return. Let your breath be the note that simply arrives, unforced, rising from that fullness and settling back into it, the way sleep itself often arrives, not through searching, but through finally letting the searching rest. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. There is a teaching in the Tao Te Ching that those who know do not always speak, and those who speak do not always know, suggesting that the deepest understanding often slips quietly past the very mind that is trying hardest to grasp it. Lao Tzu pointed toward a kind of forgetting that is not loss but simply inattention, the way a person can hold something precious so naturally that they stop registering it as precious at all until it seems to vanish from awareness even while remaining entirely in hand. What looks like a missing color, a missing piece, a missing answer is, more often than the searching mind admits, something already mixed, already known, already present, merely unnoticed beneath the urgency of looking elsewhere for it. There was once a painter known throughout the region for the colors she could coax from ordinary pigments, blues so deep they seemed to hold actual evening in them, greens so alive they seemed to breathe on the canvas. Yet she had spent years chasing one particular color she could not quite name. A shade she had glimpsed once, she believed, in the light just before dawn breaks fully over a hillside, and had never since been able to recreate. She mixed and remixed. She traveled to distant towns to buy rare pigments from foreign traders, ground minerals no one in her own region had ever heard of, tested combination after combination on scraps of cloth and bark and stone. Nothing matched the color in her memory. Each attempt came close enough to torment her, never close enough to satisfy. She consulted other painters, some quite famous in neighboring provinces, describing the color as best she could, neither blue nor violet, neither gray nor silver, something that seemed to hold all four without settling fully into any one of them. One painter suggested crushed lapis mixed with ash. Another suggested a rare dye made from a shellfish found only on a southern coast, requiring weeks of travel to obtain and a fortune to purchase. She tried both eventually at considerable expense and stood before each result with the same hollow disappointment. The color close but not close enough, like a face almost but not quite remembered. Her old teacher, a man who had stopped painting himself years before due to failing eyesight, but who still kept a small workshop where younger painters came to study, watched her grow thinner and more agitated across several seasons of this search. One afternoon, she brought him a fresh batch of failed mixtures, laid out on a board, asking him, though she knew he could no longer see colors clearly, to simply listen to her describe each one and tell her if anything in her description sounded close to what she remembered. He listened to her describe blue after blue, green-tinted blue, gray-tinted blue, blue touched faintly with violet. None of it, by her own account, was right. "Tell me about the morning you first saw this color," he said finally. She described it. The hillside, the mist still clinging low to the grass, the particular quality of light that existed only in the handful of minutes before full sunrise, neither night nor day, something suspended between the two. "And do you still have the cloth you were carrying with you that morning?" he asked. She frowned, trying to remember. "I believe so. It would be in my old chest, with other scraps I have not looked at in years." "Find it," he said, "and bring it to me." She searched her workshop until she found the chest, dusty and mostly forgotten, and inside it, folded carefully the way she once folded all her cloth before she had grown careless with success, she found the scrap she had carried that very morning years before. She had, it turned out, dipped its corner into a test mixture that day, distracted by the hillside light, and had never returned to examine what she had made. She unfolded it slowly. The corner held a faint, dried stain of color, and it was, unmistakably, exactly the shade she had spent years failing to recreate. She sat very still for a long moment, the cloth trembling slightly in her hands. "I had it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had it the entire time. I mixed it myself that very morning without even noticing what I had made, because I was looking at the hillside instead of at my own hands." Her teacher said nothing for a while, letting her sit with the discovery. "How is this possible," she finally asked him, "that I could create the very thing I spent years searching for and not know it, not even feel some flicker of recognition?" "Because your attention was on the hillside," he said, "not on the cloth in your hand. We very often create or already possess the thing we are searching for, and miss it entirely, simply because we are looking somewhere else at the moment it appears. The eye can only truly see what the attention is resting on. Everything else passes by unrecorded, however close it comes to your own fingers. Then how do I keep this from happening again? She asked. How many other things have I made or already had and simply failed to notice? That, he said, smiling faintly despite his clouded eyes, is not a question with a comfortable answer. Probably more than either of us would like to admit. The practice is not to catch every one of them. The practice is simply to look more often at your own hands, rather than always at the hillside. It seems a strange way for the world to work, she said, that a person could hold the very thing they are searching for and still feel the ache of missing it. It is stranger still, he said, how common it is. I have taught painters for 40 years, and I have lost count of how many came to me certain they lacked some skill or vision, only to discover, often by accident, that the very work they dismissed as failed practice contained exactly what they believed themselves incapable of. The ache of missing something and the actual absence of that thing are very rarely the same event, however much they feel identical from the inside. She kept the scrap of cloth for the rest of her life, pinned above her workbench, not as a finished color to copy exactly, but as a reminder of how close a thing can be while still passing entirely unnoticed. She never stopped mixing new colors, but she found herself looking more and more often at what was already drying on her own brush, rather than only at the horizon she imagined still held something better. Younger painters sometimes asked her, in later years, how she had finally found her famous hillside color, since it became in time one of the shades she was best known for. She told them honestly that she had not found it through searching at all. She had made it once, by accident, while looking somewhere else entirely, and had spent years afterward trying to recreate through effort what had first arrived through simple, unguarded attention. The finding, she would tell them, was never the hard part. The hard part was learning to notice what my own hands had already done. In Hasidic Jewish teaching, there is a similar understanding, carried in a well-known story about a man named Isaac, who dreamed repeatedly of a great treasure buried beneath a bridge in a distant city. After many dreams, he traveled there, only to be told by a guard that the bridge was watched too closely for digging, and that he, the guard, had also once dreamed of treasure buried beneath the stove of a man named Isaac in a town far away. The traveler returned home and found the treasure beneath his own stove, exactly where he had been living the entire time. There is also the Hasidic teaching, attributed to several different rabbis across generations, that a person should carry two notes, one in each pocket, one reading, "I am but dust and ashes," the other reading, "For my sake the world was created," reaching for whichever truth is needed in a given moment, recognizing that completeness and humility are not opposites, but companions, both already available without needing to travel anywhere to find them. Both teachings mirror the painter's discovery precisely. The treasure, the color, the missing piece, found finally not at the end of a long journey, but in the very place the search began. The dream sent the dreamer outward only so that he might be turned gently back toward home, the way the painter's years of travel only delivered her back to a dusty chest she had never actually unpacked. You may have your own version of the painter's cloth, some quality you have spent years believing you lack, when in fact you demonstrated it long ago and simply never noticed, distracted by some hillside of your own. Perhaps it is patience, which you believe yourself to be missing, despite the quiet daily evidence of how gently you have handled difficult people and difficult days. Perhaps it is creativity, or courage, or warmth, each one already present in choices you made without registering them as proof of anything. Tonight, rather than searching the horizon for some missing quality, consider looking instead at your own hands, your own recent days, for evidence of what you have already made and forgotten. You may find, as the painter did, that what you were searching for has been folded quietly nearby the entire time, waiting only for your attention to finally settle where it has been all along. Here, now, as you let yourself rest. You do not need to travel to a southern coast or consult a famous teacher to recover it. You only need to stop looking at the hillside for a moment and look instead at what is already resting, quiet and overlooked in your own open hand. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Lao Tzu taught that the sage rules best by doing little, by trusting that what is already present in a kingdom, a household, a life, tends to flourish on its own once the constant interference of grasping is set aside. The Tao Te Ching warns against the restless accumulation of more territory, more certainty, more proof that one's own situation is sufficient. A kingdom secure in itself does not need to measure itself against kingdoms it has never seen. A life secure in itself does not need constant comparison to confirm its own worth. And yet the habit of reaching outward for confirmation runs deep, deep enough that even those who already hold more than enough often spend their resources sending scouts toward horizons that were never going to answer the real question being asked. There was once a king who ruled a peaceful, fertile land, well watered by rivers, generous in its harvests, home to people who, by most outward measures, lived well and wanted little. Yet the king himself could not shake a persistent unease, a conviction that somewhere beyond his borders there existed a kingdom more complete than his own, one that had solved whatever quiet problem his own kingdom had not yet managed to solve. He sent scouts in every direction. To the north, to report on a kingdom said to have mastered the building of great halls that never crumbled. To the south, to report on a kingdom said to have such abundant harvests that no citizen had ever known hunger. To the east and west, toward kingdoms rumored to possess wisdom, beauty, harmony, whatever quality the king imagined might be the missing piece his own land lacked. The scouts traveled for years. They returned one by one with careful reports. The northern halls, it turned out, were indeed sturdy, but the people who lived beneath them complained constantly of cold winters and short tempers among neighbors. The southern harvests were abundant, but the people quarreled bitterly over how the abundance should be divided, and several families had not spoken to each other in a generation over old grievances about land. The Eastern Kingdom's wisdom, on closer inspection, amounted mostly to elaborate rules that exhausted everyone trying to follow them. The Western Kingdom's beauty hid considerable suffering beneath its surface, the scouts reported, suffering the kingdom's rulers preferred visitors not see too closely. The king listened to each report with growing confusion. None of these kingdoms, despite their famous qualities, seemed any more complete than his own. Each one simply lacked something different. The way every life he had ever observed lacked something different. No two lacks ever quite matching. He called for his oldest adviser, a woman who had served his father before him and who rarely spoke unless asked directly. "I do not understand," he told her. "I sent scouts to find a kingdom without the troubles mine has. Instead, I have learned only that every kingdom has troubles, simply different ones." "What troubles do you imagine your own kingdom suffers from?" she asked. He considered this carefully. "We have enough grain. We have peace with our neighbors mostly. Our people do not go without shelter. And yet I cannot shake the feeling that something essential is still missing, something the other kingdoms might have found and we have not." "Have you asked your own people," she said, "whether they feel this same lack?" He admitted he had not. He had only assumed it, the way a person assumes a stranger's house is tidier, simply because they have not been inside to check. "Then perhaps," she said, "before sending more scouts beyond our borders, you might walk through your own villages and ask directly, not as a king inspecting his kingdom, but as a man wondering honestly what is actually missing rather than what he has decided in advance must be missing." He took her advice. He traveled in plain clothes through villages he had not visited personally in years, asking ordinary questions of ordinary people. Were they content? Did they feel they lacked anything essential? What, if given the chance, would they ask of their king? Most answers surprised him. A farmer told him he wanted nothing more than the rain to keep coming as it had. A weaver told him she wished only for her daughter's health to remain steady through the coming winter. An old man told him he had everything he needed and worried mainly about the king sending too many scouts abroad instead of attending to small repairs on the village well. The king returned to his palace troubled in a new way, not by lack, but by the strange discovery that his own restless searching had perhaps cost more than it had ever returned. The scouts' journeys had taken years and considerable treasure, and what they had brought back in the end was simply confirmation that every kingdom carried its own particular difficulties, none of them resolved by being some other kingdom instead. He summoned his adviser once more. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have been searching for a kingdom without trouble, when no such kingdom exists anywhere in any direction. What I actually needed to ask was whether my own kingdom's troubles were ones I could tend to directly here, rather than escape by imagining someone else had escaped them. That," she said, "is usually the more useful question. It is also, I will admit, a far less interesting one to send scouts looking for. There is no glory in repairing a well. There is considerable glory imagined in discovering some kingdom with no wells in need of repair at all." The king laughed a little ruefully. "And no such kingdom exists. None that my own scouting many years ago in my own youth ever managed to find," she said. I traveled further than you in my time, looking for exactly what you have been looking for. I came home with the same answer you have just arrived at, though it took me considerably longer to admit it. Tell me, the king said, what were you looking for all those years ago, and what finally turned you back toward home? I was looking for a kingdom where no one grieved, she said finally. My mother had died that year, and I could not believe grief was a permanent feature of any life, anywhere. If only I searched far enough to find the exception. I found instead kingdoms with different sorrows wearing different shapes, one grieving lost children, another grieving the slow loss of any reason to struggle together once hunger had been solved. Sorrow did not disappear anywhere I traveled. It simply wore a different shape in each place, the way water takes the shape of whatever container holds it without ceasing to be water. I returned home carrying my own grief, unsolved, but somehow less isolating once I understood it was not a flaw unique to my own kingdom. In the years that followed, the king stopped sending scouts beyond his borders in search of some more complete kingdom. He spent the treasure instead on village wells, on roads, on small steady repairs to the life already present within his own land. His kingdom did not become perfect. It remained, as every kingdom does, a place with its own particular troubles. But the king found that tending those troubles directly brought him a steadier peace than any report of distant lands ever had, however impressive those reports first sounded upon arrival. In Japanese Zen tradition, there is a similar understanding, carried in the practice of ichigo, ichie, often translated as one time, one meeting, a reminder that each moment carries its own complete and unrepeatable fullness, not waiting to be improved by comparison to some other moment, past or imagined. A tea ceremony conducted under this understanding treats the present gathering as wholly sufficient in itself, deserving full attention rather than restless thoughts of some better gathering that might happen elsewhere some day. There is also the related teaching found in many Zen gardens, where a single carefully placed stone, a single raked line in gravel, is understood to be complete exactly as it is, requiring no further stone, no further line to finish what was never actually unfinished. Both teachings mirror the king's eventual discovery precisely, that the search for a more complete kingdom elsewhere was, from the very beginning, a refusal to meet the one kingdom actually in front of him, fully as it already was. You may recognize the king's restless scouting in your own habits, researching other cities you imagine you should live in, scrolling through other people's curated lives, wondering whether their version of things has solved some problem yours has not, certain that somewhere else, some other arrangement of circumstances would finally settle the unease you carry. Examined honestly, as the king discovered, most of those other lives carry their own particular difficulties, simply different ones, no more resolved than your own. Tonight, rather than sending your attention scouting towards some imagined, more complete life, let it rest instead in your own village, your own home, your own bed. Notice what is actually here, tended and steady, rather than what some other arrangement might promise from a distance. Let this single moment, exactly as it is, be enough for tonight, the way the king's wells became enough once he finally stopped looking past them. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching speaks of the newborn child as a kind of model, soft and unguarded, not because a child knows more than an adult, but because a child has not yet learned to doubt what is directly in front of them. Lauder suggested that the sage returns, in some sense, to this same simplicity, trusting direct experience over the elaborate stories the mind constructs about what should or should not be there. A child who believes a toy is lost will search frantically, weep sincerely, and feel the loss with total conviction, even while still gripping the toy in question. The conviction of loss, in a child or an adult, can be entirely sincere and entirely mistaken at the same time, and only a return to plain, unguarded looking tends to resolve the difference. There was once a child who lived near a great forest with her grandmother, a woman known throughout the nearby villages for her patience with frightened animals and frightened children alike. The child had a small wooden bird, carved by her grandfather before he passed, painted in faded reds and blues, which she carried with her everywhere and loved beyond any of her other belongings. One afternoon, playing near the edge of the forest, she became suddenly and completely convinced that the bird was gone. She did not remember setting it down. She only knew, in the way children know things with total certainty and no particular evidence, that it was lost, and that this loss was catastrophic, unbearable, the worst thing that had ever happened to her in her short life. She ran to her grandmother in tears, describing the disaster in breathless detail. She had looked everywhere. The bird was nowhere. It was gone, gone forever, and nothing would ever be right again. Her grandmother knelt down to meet her at eye level, the way she always did when the child was upset, and did not immediately try to comfort her or correct her. "Tell me where you looked," her grandmother said. The child described, between sobs, the places she had searched. The grass by the stream, the hollow log where she sometimes hid things, the path back toward the house. "And did you look in your own hand?" her grandmother asked gently. The child stopped crying for a moment, confused by the question, and looked down at her own fist, which she had not thought to examine because, in her mind, an empty search meant an empty hand, and she had been too busy searching elsewhere to check the thing she was already holding. Her hand was closed tightly around the small wooden bird. It had been there the entire time. She stared at it for a long moment, the tears still wet on her cheeks, her small understanding visibly struggling to reconcile the bird's presence with the absolute certainty of loss she had felt only moments before. "But I thought it was gone," she said, her voice small and a little bewildered. "I felt it was gone. How could I feel something so strongly and be wrong about it?" Her grandmother considered the question carefully, because it was, she recognized, a very good question, the kind children sometimes ask without realizing how large it is. Feelings are very good at telling you that something is true, her grandmother said. They are not always as good at telling you what that something actually is. You felt loss. The feeling was real, but the feeling was about your fear of losing the bird, not about whether the bird was actually lost. Those are two different things, even though they can feel exactly the same inside your chest. How do I know the difference? The child asked. If they feel the same, that, her grandmother said, smiling, is the question grown people spend their whole lives learning to answer, and most of them are still working on it when they are my age. But here is a small start. When the feeling of loss arrives, before you believe it completely, look first at what your own hand is already holding. Very often you will find it there, the way you just did. The child looked down at the bird again, turning it slowly in her palm, as though seeing it freshly for the first time, though it had never actually left her grip. "Will this happen again?" she asked. "Will I feel like something is lost when it is not?" "Probably," her grandmother said. "It happens to grown people more than you might think, not always with toys, sometimes with love, or with the feeling of being good enough, or with a sense that life is missing something important. People feel the loss of these things very convincingly and then go searching everywhere outside themselves when very often, like your bird, the thing was simply being held without being noticed." The child sat with this for a while, still holding the bird, her sobs fully settled now into a kind of thoughtful quiet. "I am going to try to remember to look at my hand first," she said finally, with the particular solemnity children bring to small promises. "That," her grandmother said, "would make you wiser than most people manage to become, even after many more years of practice than you have had." They sat together at the edge of the forest a while longer, the afternoon light slanting gold through the trees, the child's hand resting easily now around the bird she had never actually lost, only forgotten she was holding. "Grandmother," the child said after a while, "did this ever happen to you when you were small?" Her grandmother laughed, a low, warm sound. "More times than I could count. I once searched our entire house for a ribbon I was certain my sister had stolen, weeping the whole time about the unfairness of it, only to find it tied in my own hair, where my mother had placed it that very morning." "Were you embarrassed?" the child asked. "A little," her grandmother admitted, "but mostly I was relieved. It is a strange kind of relief finding out the disaster was never real. The fear felt enormous while it lasted, and then it simply dissolved the moment I looked in the right place, as though it had never had any real weight to begin with." "Does the fear ever feel real again, even after you know better?" "Often," her grandmother said. "Knowing better does not always stop the fear from arriving. It only gives you a faster way back out of it, once you remember to look at your own hand instead of trusting the fear's first loud report." The child nodded slowly, turning the wooden bird over once more in her palm, watching the faded red of its painted wing catch the late light. "I think I understand," she said, "even if I will probably forget it again the next time something feels lost." "That," her grandmother said, "is exactly how it goes for everyone. The forgetting is not a failure, it is simply the practice. You remember, you forget, you remember again. Each time you remember a little faster than before." In Celtic wisdom, there is a similar understanding, carried in the old idea of thin places, locations where the boundary between the ordinary world and something larger is said to grow soft enough to glimpse through. Many Celtic teachers suggested that these places were not actually rarer or more sacred than anywhere else, only places where people happened to slow down enough to notice what had been present everywhere all along, hidden mostly by haste, rather than by any real absence. There is also a teaching found in Celtic storytelling traditions about the other world existing not at some far distant edge of the map, but layered directly alongside ordinary life, often separated by nothing more than a person's distracted attention. A traveler in these stories frequently finds the door to the other world not at the end of a long quest, but in a familiar hedge or hollow they had passed 100 times without ever truly looking. Both teachings mirror the grandmother's gentle correction precisely, that what feels distant or lost is very often simply unnoticed, present the entire time in a hand, a hedge, a hollow, waiting only for attention to finally arrive there. The thinness, in both cases, exists in the seeker's attention rather than in any actual distance between worlds. You may recognize this same convincing feeling of loss in your own adult life, even though the object of the loss looks nothing like a wooden bird. Perhaps you feel that you have lost your sense of purpose, when in fact it is simply quieter than it used to be, still present, still held, asking only to be noticed rather than rediscovered from scratch. Perhaps you feel you have lost your connection to people you love, when distance has only made the connection harder to feel, not actually severed it. Tonight, before believing completely in whatever sense of lack has followed you into this bed, try the child's small practice. Look first at what your own hand, your own life, is already holding. You may find, the way she did, that what felt entirely gone only moments ago has been resting there the whole time, patient and unbothered, waiting for your attention to finally come home to it. You do not need to solve the larger question tonight of whether the feeling is accurate. You only need to notice, gently, that feelings of loss and actual loss are not always the same event, however convincingly they can resemble one another in the moment they arrive. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching teaches that a journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath one's own feet, and yet it says less often, though it is equally true, that some journeys end exactly where they began, the traveler arriving home only to discover they had departed from home in the first place, in spirit if not in body. Lauder pointed toward a stillness at the center of all movement, a root beneath all branching, suggesting that even the most determined searching eventually circles back to its own starting point, not as failure, but as completion. A sailor convinced the answer lies always at the next shore may spend a lifetime crossing water, only to discover that the shore he departed from held everything the distant ones promised, simply dressed in more familiar clothing. There was once a sailor who grew restless in his home port, certain that some other shore, somewhere beyond the horizon, held a life more vivid and complete than the one waiting for him at home. He signed on to trading ships bound for distant waters, telling himself each time that this voyage, unlike the last, would finally deliver him somewhere worth staying. He sailed to a port crowded with spice merchants, where the air itself seemed colored by foreign scents, and felt for several days that he had finally found the vivid life he had been chasing. He walked the markets for hours, marveling at colors and sounds unlike anything in his home port, certain that this richness, finally, was the missing ingredient his old life had lacked. The feeling faded within weeks, the way novelty always does, leaving him standing on unfamiliar docks with the same old restlessness quietly returned, simply wearing different scenery. He sailed to an island known for its gentle climate and its people's apparent ease, where he was told no one there ever seemed to hurry or worry the way people did in colder ports. He stayed nearly a year, working alongside local fishermen, learning their methods, admiring their unhurried days. And yet, in time, even this ease began to feel like simply another shore, pleasant but not, in itself, the answer he had been searching for. He sailed to a northern harbour town famous for its festivals, its music, its long winter nights filled with storytelling and shared warmth around enormous fires. He found genuine joy there for a season and told himself this, finally, was the shore he had been seeking all along. But the season ended, as seasons do, and the restlessness returned once more, patient and familiar, like an old travelling companion he had never quite managed to leave behind on any dock. After many years of this, weathered and tired in a way that had little to do with his actual age, he found himself, almost by accident, sailing back toward the small port where he had been born, having taken on a final cargo run he could have easily declined. He did not expect to feel anything in particular returning. He had grown used to ports meaning very little to him beyond their immediate pleasures and disappointments. But as the ship came into the harbour, and he recognized the particular slant of the cliffs above the town, the particular color the water turned in late afternoon light, something in his chest loosened that he had not realized was tight. He found an old friend still living near the docks, a woman who had stayed in the port his whole absence, mending nets much the way she always had, who greeted him with the easy familiarity of someone who had never needed him to become anyone different than the boy she remembered. "You look tired," she said after the first embrace. "I have seen a great deal," he said. "Spice markets, gentle islands, festivals that lasted entire winters. I thought, each time, that I had finally found the shore I was looking for." "And had you?" she asked. "For a while," he admitted, "and then, always, the feeling faded, and I would set sail again." She considered this for a while, watching the boat settle in the harbour with the changing tide. "What were you actually looking for?" she asked. "Beneath all those different shores?" He thought about this longer than he expected to need to. "I think," he said slowly, "I was looking for a feeling of having arrived, of being somewhere I did not need to leave." "And do you feel that now?" she asked, "standing on this dock where you were born?" He was quiet for a long moment, testing the question honestly rather than answering it quickly. "I think I do," he said finally, with some surprise in his own voice. "Though I cannot entirely explain why this shore, of all the shores I have stood on, is the one that finally feels like a rival." Perhaps, she said, because this is the one shore you were not trying to prove anything to yourself about. You came back almost by accident, without expecting it to be the answer. And so you were finally free to simply notice what was actually here, rather than searching it for proof of something it needed to provide. I want to believe that, he said, but I am afraid that if I stay, the restlessness will simply return, the way it always has, on every shore I have ever convinced myself was finally enough. Perhaps it will, she said. Restlessness is a stubborn traveling companion, but notice the difference this time. Every other shore, you arrived already searching, already certain there was something to prove. This time, you arrived simply because a cargo run brought you here. You were not trying to make this shore into anything. And so, for the first time in years, you were free to actually feel it, rather than test it. He considered this carefully, watching a gull settle on a post nearby, entirely unconcerned with shores or arrivals or any of the questions troubling him. So the difference was never really the shore, he said slowly. It was how I arrived at it. That has always seemed true to me, she said, though I have never sailed anywhere to confirm it myself. I simply stayed and watched others arrive and depart, searching and returning, and noticed that the ones who finally settled were rarely the ones who found some perfect place. They were the ones who finally stopped requiring the place to be perfect before they would allow themselves to rest in it. He stayed in that port for the rest of his life, though he occasionally still sailed short distances along the coast, no longer searching, simply enjoying the movement of water beneath a familiar hull. He told the story of his travels often, to younger sailors restless the way he had once been, and he always ended it the same way. I crossed more water than I can properly remember, he would tell them, looking for a shore that would finally feel like home. And in the end, the shore that felt like home was the one I had been standing on the whole time I was learning to walk, before I ever set sail looking for it elsewhere. In African Ubuntu philosophy, there is a similar understanding, often summarized in the phrase, I am because we are, a recognition that a person's wholeness is not an isolated achievement reached at the end of some personal quest, but something already constituted by belonging, by relationship, by the community a person was born into and never truly separate from. The sailor's restless search for a vivid, complete life elsewhere mirrors a common misunderstanding Ubuntu philosophy directly addresses, the belief that fulfillment must be built or found individually, away from one's own people and one's own place. There is also a teaching within Ubuntu thought that a person becomes most fully themselves through return and reconnection, rather than departure and accumulation. That the self is completed not by adding new experiences from distant shores, but by deepening the relationships and belonging already available close to home. Both points mirror the sailor's discovery precisely. His sense of arrival did not come from anything new he acquired on his travels. It came from returning to a place and a person who had never required him to become anyone other than who he already was. Ubuntu thought would say he had never truly been incomplete, only disconnected from the relationships that had quietly held his completeness for him the entire time he was away. You may carry your own version of the sailor's restlessness, even without ever boarding a ship, a persistent sense that a different city, a different social circle, a fuller calendar of activity would finally deliver the feeling of having arrived somewhere worth staying. Examined honestly, as the sailor discovered, each new shore tends to offer its own brief lift, followed by the same old quiet return of restlessness, dressed differently each time, but fundamentally familiar. Tonight, rather than searching for the next shore, let your attention settle into the one you are actually on. This room, this bed, the people and life already woven around you, however ordinary they may feel by comparison to some imagined elsewhere. Let this moment, examined without the need to prove anything, be the shore that finally feels like arrival, the way it did for the sailor the moment he stopped expecting it to be anything other than home. You do not need to test this bed the way the sailor once tested each new shore. You only need to let it hold you exactly as it already is. Follow and creel, follow and creel. One give to let it hold you, exactly as it already is. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now. Not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching describes a way of acting without forcing, of allowing what is already in motion to continue without unnecessary interference, trusting that the pattern unfolding has its own coherence even when a single thread is hard to trace by eye. Lauder suggested that the great pattern is rarely visible all at once, only in fragments, and that searching anxiously for the missing piece of a pattern can blind a person to the pattern's actual completeness, already woven, already whole, simply too large to take in from any single thread's narrow point of view. What looks like an absence in the design is often only a place where the eye has not yet learned to see how the threads already connect. There was once a weaver renowned for the cloth she produced, intricate patterns that seemed, to those who admired them, to hold entire stories within their woven lines. Yet she herself remained convinced, season after season, that one particular thread was missing from her current piece. A thread she could picture clearly in her mind, but could never locate among her materials or within the cloth itself once it was finished. She would finish a piece, examine it by lamplight, and feel a familiar disappointment settle over her, certain that some essential strand had gone missing somewhere in the weaving, leaving the pattern incomplete in a way she could sense but not quite name. Her customers never noticed anything missing. They praised her work as some of the finest in the region, but she could not shake the conviction that she alone could see the gap, the thread that should have been there and was not. Her mother, who had taught her to weave as a girl and who still occasionally visited her workshop, noticed this growing unease over several seasons and finally asked her about it directly. "You finish beautiful work," her mother said, "and yet you look at it as though it failed you. What do you see that I do not?" "A missing thread," the weaver said. I can almost see where it should be, a particular shade woven through the pattern at a particular angle. Without it, I feel the whole cloth is somehow unfinished, even though I could not point to the exact place it belongs. Her mother examined the most recent piece carefully, running her fingers along its surface the way she had taught her daughter to do decades before, checking for flaws by touch as much as by sight. "I do not feel any gap here," her mother said. "The weave is tight throughout. Nothing pulls loose. Nothing is thin where it should be thick." "I know it should feel complete," the weaver said, frustration creeping into her voice. "And yet it does not to me. I have felt this same incompleteness in every piece I have made for years now." Her mother sat with the cloth a long while, turning it over, holding it to the light from different angles, before she spoke again. "Tell me about this thread you imagine is missing," she said. "What color is it? What does it feel like in your memory?" Sometimes describing a thing plainly is enough to loosen its grip a little. The weaver described it as best she could, a deep, warm thread, somewhere between russet and gold, the kind of color she associated with the last hour of autumn light before evening fully arrives. Her mother considered this for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, gentle and a little sad. "That color," she said, "was your grandmother's favorite dye. She used it in nearly everything she wove in the years before she died. You were very young then. I do not think you remember choosing to leave it out of your own work. I think you simply never inherited her particular dye recipe, and so it disappeared from your weaving without your ever deciding it should." The weaver sat very still, the cloth resting in her lap, something working its way slowly through her chest. "Then the missing thread," she said quietly, "is not actually missing from this cloth. It is missing from my memory of her, and I have been searching every piece I weave for a thread that was never meant to be in this cloth at all. It belonged in hers." "I think that may be closer to the truth," her mother said. "Grief is very good at disguising itself as a flaw in present work. It convinces you something is wrong with what is in front of you, when the actual ache belongs to something behind you, something finished long ago that you have not yet fully let settle." "What do I do with that?" the weaver asked. "I cannot weave her back into existence. I cannot recreate a dye recipe I never learned." Her mother reached over and took her daughter's hand. "You do not need to recreate her thread," she said. "You only need to recognize that your own cloth was never lacking it in the first place. Her weaving was complete in its own way. Yours is complete in its own different way. The ache you feel is not a flaw in your pattern. It is simply love, still present, looking for somewhere to land." "Will the ache ever fully leave?" the weaver asked her mother. "Or will I simply keep weaving around it for the rest of my life?" Her mother considered this honestly before answering. "I do not think grief works the way a missing thread works," she said. "A missing thread can sometimes be found, or replaced, or simply left out without harm. Grief tends to stay in some quiet form for as long as the love that caused it stays. I do not think you should expect it to disappear. I think you should expect it to soften and to stop disguising itself as a flaw in your present work once you recognize it clearly for what it actually is." "That sounds like something to live with," the weaver said slowly, "rather than something to solve, which is not at all what I expected to hear tonight." "Most of the truest things are," her mother said. "I have woven beside grief of my own for longer than you have been alive. It does not ruin the cloth. It simply asks, every so often, to be remembered rather than mistaken for a flaw. The weaver wove for many more years after that conversation, and the old sense of an unnamed missing thread slowly quieted. Not because she found a way to weave in her grandmother's particular color, but because she finally understood what she had actually been grieving each time she felt that familiar gap. She began, instead, to choose one new color each season, deliberately in her grandmother's memory, not as a replacement for the missing thread, but as its own complete tribute, woven freshly rather than recovered from an old absence. Her own daughter, years later, would ask her about a similar feeling in her own weaving. Certain something was missing that she could not name, and the weaver would sit with her exactly as her own mother once had, asking gently where the feeling actually belonged before assuming it pointed to any flaw in the cloth currently on the loom, patient in a way she had learned slowly, thread by thread, across many seasons of her own. In Polynesian wayfinding tradition, there is a similar understanding, carried in the practice of reading the ocean as a single interconnected whole rather than a series of separate signs to be collected and assembled. Traditional navigators were taught to sense the entire pattern of swells, stars, winds, and bird flight together, trusting that the full picture was always present and coherent, even when any single element examined alone seemed incomplete or contradictory, or pointed in a direction that briefly contradicted the others. There is also the navigational principle that a wayfinder does not search desperately for a missing piece of information when the destination feels uncertain, but instead trusts the larger pattern already being read, allowing temporary gaps in clarity to resolve themselves as the journey continues, rather than treating every uncertain moment as evidence of failure. Both principles mirror the weaver's discovery precisely. A single missing element, when examined within the whole pattern rather than isolated from it, very often turns out to belong to a different, already completed pattern entirely, rather than indicating any actual flaw in the one currently being made. You may carry your own version of the weaver's missing thread, a vague, persistent sense that something essential is absent from your current life, without being able to name exactly what it is. Sometimes, examined honestly, this sense of absence belongs not to the present at all, but to grief, to a past chapter that has not yet fully settled, disguising itself as a flaw in the life you are living now. Perhaps it is a parent no longer here to call, or a version of yourself from years ago whose certainty you still quietly miss. Tonight, if you notice such a feeling rising, consider asking it gently where it actually belongs, rather than assuming it points to some present lack that must be urgently filled. You may find, as the weaver did, that your current life is more complete than it feels, and that the old ache belongs somewhere else entirely, asking only to be recognized rather than repaired. Let that recognition settle you tonight, the cloth of your life whole exactly as it is, even the threads that carry quiet grief rather than absence. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching opens with the warning that the way which can be fully spoken is not the lasting way, suggesting that some understanding resists being captured entirely in words, even as it remains fully present and complete without ever needing to be captured. Lao Da taught that excessive study can sometimes obscure rather than reveal, that a person can accumulate vast knowledge while drifting further from the simple, immediate knowing that required no accumulation at all. A scholar searching through countless texts for the answer to some essential question may overlook, in his haste to gather more, the answer already recorded plainly in his own earlier notes, written in his own hand, in a season when he understood something he later forgot he had ever known. There was once a scholar who devoted his life to a single question: what makes a life complete? He read every text he could acquire on the subject, traveled to distant libraries, corresponded for years with other scholars who shared his interest, and filled shelf after shelf with his own careful notes, cross-referenced and indexed with the meticulous attention of a man convinced the answer was simply a matter of sufficient diligence. Decades passed this way. His hair grayed, his eyesight weakened from years of reading by lamplight, and still, despite the volume of his collected wisdom, he felt no closer to answering his original question than he had as a young man setting out on his first research journey. One winter, snowed into his study for several days with no fresh material to occupy him, he found himself, out of simple boredom, pulling down some of his earliest notebooks, the ones from his first years of study, faded and slightly brittle now, written in a younger hand he barely recognized as his own. He expected, reading them, to find only the clumsy beginnings of a mind not yet sophisticated enough to grasp the question properly. Instead, turning the pages, he found something that stopped him cold. In the margin of one early notebook, in his own handwriting, beside a passage he had clearly been struggling to understand at the time, he had written a brief note to himself: "Perhaps the question is wrong. Perhaps completeness is not something achieved through more knowledge, but something already present, simply obscured by the act of searching for it." He stared at this sentence for a long time. He had no memory of writing it. And yet there it was, in ink he recognized, dated to a season nearly 30 years before, when he had been young and uncertain and had not yet built the towering structure of accumulated study that now filled his shelves. He went looking with growing unease through more of his earliest notebooks, and found similar fragments scattered throughout, small, tentative observations that, read now with 30 years of additional study behind him, struck him as more clear-sighted than almost anything he had written since. He had, it seemed, brushed against the answer very early in his own unguarded thinking, and then spent the following decades building an elaborate scholarly apparatus that had, somehow, carried him steadily further from that early clarity rather than closer to it. He sought out an old friend, another scholar who had studied alongside him in their youth, but who had since largely abandoned formal study for a quieter life, tending an orchard outside the city, content, it seemed, with considerably less written certainty than the scholar himself had ever managed to settle for. "I have found something troubling in my own old notes," he told his friend, showing him the early notebook. I seem to have understood something at 25 that I have spent the following decades failing to recover, despite considerably more study." His friend read the passage carefully, then looked up at him with an expression that was sympathetic, but not entirely surprised. "Why does this trouble you?" his friend asked. "It sounds to me like good news. The understanding was never actually lost. You simply buried it under more material than you needed." "But why would I bury it?" the scholar asked. "If I already glimpsed something true, why would I spend 30 years moving away from it rather than toward it?" His friend considered this for a while, turning the question over the way he might turn over a piece of fruit, checking it for ripeness. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "because a simple truth, once seen clearly, can feel almost too modest to satisfy a young scholar eager to build something impressive. You glimpsed something true and quiet at 25, and some part of you decided it could not possibly be the whole answer, because it had cost you so little effort to see. So you went looking for something that would feel more deserving of the labor you were prepared to invest." The scholar sat with this for a long while, the old notebook open in his lap. "Then the labor itself," he said finally, "may have been the obstacle, not the path." "I would not go quite that far," his friend said. "The labor likely taught you a great many things worth knowing, but I suspect it also convinced you, gradually, that the truth had to be hard-won to be valid, when this particular truth, it seems, was simply waiting quietly for you to notice it, available from the very beginning." "What do you intend to do now?" his friend asked, "with 30 years of careful scholarship sitting on your shelves, if the answer you needed was already there at the start?" "I am not certain," the scholar admitted. "Part of me wants to burn it all and start again from that early notebook. Part of me cannot quite let go of work I gave my whole life to." "I would not burn anything," his friend said. "The later work is not worthless simply because it was not strictly necessary. It taught you a great deal, even if the destination turned out to be closer than the journey suggested. I would simply stop treating it as more trustworthy than your earliest instincts, purely because it cost you more years to produce." "That seems a difficult habit to break," the scholar said, "after 30 years of believing the opposite." "Most worthwhile habits are difficult to break," his friend said. "That has never yet been a good reason to leave them unbroken." The scholar did not abandon his studies after that winter, but he began returning regularly to his earliest notebooks, treating them no longer as the clumsy beginnings of an inferior mind, but as a kind of unguarded wisdom his later, more elaborate thinking had partly obscured. He found, rereading them across the following years, that he trusted his own early instincts more and more, and trusted the towering apparatus of his later scholarship somewhat less, though he never stopped adding to it, simply because building had become, by then, its own kind of comfort, separate from the question it had originally been meant to answer. He began, too, advising the younger scholars who occasionally sought his guidance to keep their earliest notebooks close at hand, no matter how far their later study carried them, since the simplest truths he had learned tend to arrive earliest and leave quietly, long before a person realizes they have wandered away from them, and tend to be found again only by those willing to look backward as readily as forward. In Aboriginal Australian songline traditions, There is a similar understanding carried in the practice of tracing ancestral pathways across the land through song, story, and memory, rather than through written accumulation, passed from elder to younger generations across countless years without ever being set down on a page. These songlines are understood not as knowledge to be acquired from outside sources, but as pathways already present in the land and already carried, in some sense, within those who walk them, requiring attentive remembering rather than new discovery. There is also a teaching within these traditions that elders often emphasize listening over collecting, suggesting that a person who gathers too much unprocessed information without sufficient stillness can lose the thread of the songline entirely, mistaking accumulation for understanding. Both principles mirror the scholar's discovery precisely. The pathway he needed had already been sung, faintly, in his own earliest notes, and his later accumulation of material, however impressive in volume, had partly buried the song rather than completing it. The songline was never lost. It had simply gone quiet beneath the noise of everything gathered on top of it. You may carry your own version of the scholar's buried notebook, an early instinct, a quiet certainty you held before the noise of comparison, achievement, and accumulated opinion began to drown it out. Perhaps you knew, as a much younger person, something true and simple about what actually mattered to you, before years of advice and ambition convinced you that truth needed to be more complicated, more hard-won, to be trusted. Tonight, rather than searching for new understanding, consider what you may have already known long ago, before the searching began in earnest. You may find, as the scholar did, that the answer was never missing from your life. It was only buried beneath the accumulating effort of looking for it elsewhere, waiting patiently in your own early handwriting for you to turn back and read it again. You do not need to retrieve every old notebook tonight. You only need to trust, gently, that the early clarity is still there, somewhere beneath the years, intact and undiminished by however much has been built on top of it since. Let us pause here for a moment, take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching describes those who know enough as wealthy, regardless of what they actually hold, suggesting that wealth is less a measure of possession than a measure of recognition, a willingness to see what is already present as sufficient. Lao Tzu taught that the sage travels without leaving, achieves without striving, suggesting a kind of arrival available even to those who appear outwardly to be still in motion. A traveler convinced that home exists somewhere ahead of him may walk for years without noticing that he has already, in some essential sense, arrived, simply because arrival rarely announces itself with the fanfare the searching mind expects. There was once a traveller who had been walking for so many years that he had merely forgotten the reason he first set out. He remembered only that, as a young man, he had left his birthplace in search of a home that would finally feel complete, a place where the persistent restlessness in his chest would settle once and for all. He passed through countless towns and villages along the way. Some offered him work, and he stayed for a season or two before the old restlessness stirred again and sent him onward. Some offered him companionship, friendships that felt warm and genuine while they lasted, and still, eventually, he found himself packing his few belongings and walking on, convinced that the true home, the one that would finally still the restlessness, waited somewhere further along the road. One evening, exhausted after an unusually long day of walking, he stopped at a small inn at a crossroads run by an elderly innkeeper who had clearly seen many travelers pass through over the years and had grown skilled at reading the particular weariness each one carried. "You walk like a man searching for something," the innkeeper observed, setting a bowl of soup in front of him. "I am searching for home," the traveler admitted. "I have been searching for many years now. I begin to wonder if I will ever find it." "What does this home look like?" the innkeeper asked. "In your mind when you imagine finally arriving?" The traveler considered the question carefully, surprised to find that it was harder to answer than he expected. "I am not entirely certain," he admitted. "I imagine, I suppose, a feeling more than a place, a sense of having finally stopped needing anything else." "And have you ever felt that, even briefly, anywhere along your travels?" the innkeeper asked. The traveller thought back across his many years of walking. "There have been moments," he said slowly. "An evening in a fishing village, watching the sun set over water, when I felt for a short while that I needed nothing more than what was directly in front of me. A morning in the mountains, walking alone in fresh snow, when the same feeling arrived just as briefly. But it never lasted. The restlessness always returned, and I always found myself walking on, certain those feelings had been incomplete previews of some fuller arrival, still waiting ahead." The innkeeper nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had long suspected about travellers in general. "Tell me," he said, "in those moments, the sunset, the snow, what was actually missing? Not what you feared might return later. What was missing in the moment itself, while you were standing in it?" The traveller sat with the question a long while, the soup cooling slightly in front of him. "Nothing," he admitted finally, with some surprise in his own voice. "Nothing was missing in those moments. They felt complete, exactly as they were. And yet you walked on from each of them," the innkeeper said, "as though they had failed some test." "I suppose I did," the traveller said. "I assumed the feeling would not last, and so I treated it as a sign that the true home was still elsewhere, rather than treating the feeling itself as the home I had been searching for." The innkeeper was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "Many travellers tell me a version of this same story," he said. "They describe moments of complete arrival and then dismiss those very moments because the moments did not last forever. They want a home that, once found, will never again require attention or renewal. But I have run this inn for 40 years, and I have never met anyone, traveller or otherwise, who found such a home. Arrival, in my experience, is not a permanent state achieved once and held forever. It is something closer to breath, arriving, releasing, arriving again, each time complete in itself, regardless of what came before or what comes after." "Then I have been arriving all along," the traveller said slowly, "without recognizing it, because I expected arrival to announce itself permanently rather than visit me briefly and then ask to be welcomed again later. That has been my experience of most travelers who eventually stop walking, the innkeeper said. Not because they finally found some perfect unchanging home, but because they finally recognized that home had been visiting them all along in small, unrepeatable moments, and that the visiting itself was the home rather than some grander, permanent arrival still waiting up the road. The traveller stayed at that inn longer than he had intended, several weeks rather than his usual few days, simply sitting with this new way of understanding his own years of walking. When he finally did continue on, he found that something in his pace had changed. Slower now, less urgent, less convinced that the next town held something the previous ones had lacked. Before he left the inn, he asked the innkeeper one final question. If arrival is something that visits rather than something achieved once and kept, he said, how do I trust it the next time it visits me? How do I keep from walking away from it again the way I walked away from the sunset and the snow? The innkeeper considered this for a long moment. I do not think trusting it requires anything elaborate, he said. I think it only requires noticing, in the moment itself, that nothing is missing, and then resisting the old habit of immediately asking what comes next. The asking is what carries most travelers away from arrival before they have had a chance to actually rest in it. That sounds simpler than I expected, the traveller said. It is simple, the innkeeper agreed. It is not, in my experience, easy. Most travelers find it considerably harder to stay inside a complete moment than to keep walking toward an incomplete one. The walking, oddly enough, feels safer, because at least it promises something is still coming. And staying promises nothing? Staying promises nothing beyond what is already here, the innkeeper said, which is, I have come to believe, usually a great deal more than it first appears to be. He did eventually settle in a small coastal village, not because it surpassed every other place he had passed through, but because he finally stopped requiring any place to surpass the others before he would allow himself to rest in it. He told people in his later years that he had found home not at the end of his travels, but in the middle of them. The evening by the water, the morning in the snow, moments he had once dismissed as incomplete previews of something better, only to realize, much later, that they had already been the thing itself. In Mayan cosmology, there is a similar understanding, carried in the concept of cyclical time, where each moment is understood not as a single point on an endless line stretching toward some distant future completion, but as part of a recurring pattern, each cycle whole and complete in itself, echoing and renewing rather than simply progressing toward a final destination. The Mayan calendar systems reflect this belief, marking returning cycles of time as meaningful completions in their own right, not merely waypoints towards something greater still ahead. There is also a teaching within Mayan thought regarding the world tree, a symbol understood to connect different planes of existence simultaneously rather than sequentially, suggesting that completeness does not require traveling from one realm to another in search of some higher fulfillment, but exists already in the connection between all the layers a person already inhabits at once. Both ideas mirror the traveler's discovery precisely. Arrival was never a single distant destination on a line he had not yet reached. It was a recurring, renewable moment, available each time he stopped long enough to notice it, exactly as it had been in the fishing village and the snowy mountains he once dismissed as incomplete. You may carry your own version of the traveler's restlessness, even without any actual road beneath your feet. A habit of treating good moments as previews of some better, more permanent happiness still ahead, rather than recognizing them as complete arrivals in their own right. A pleasant evening with people you love. A quiet morning before the day's demands begin. Each one dismissed, perhaps, as not quite enough, simply because it did not last forever. Tonight, consider that arrival may not need to be permanent to be real. This moment, here in your bed, settling towards sleep, does not need to promise you tomorrow will feel the same. To be complete in itself tonight, let it be enough exactly as it is. The way the traveller's sunset and snow were always enough, long before he finally let himself believe it, without needing to ask what would come after. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. The Tao Te Ching closes with a vision of the sage who gives without depleting, who acts without striving, suggesting that a complete life is not one stacked carefully with sufficient accomplishment, but one lived in harmony with what is already unfolding, season after season, without forcing. Lauda suggested that the 10,000 things flourish best when left largely undisturbed, and that this principle applies as much to a person's own sense of completeness as it does to any garden. A gardener convinced his most precious bloom has failed to appear may walk the length of his garden searching ahead, never once turning to look behind him, where the very flower he sought has already opened quietly, in his own absence of looking. There was once a gardener who tended a large garden behind a modest house, known throughout the surrounding villages for the unusual care he gave to a particular variety of flower, pale and fragrant, that bloomed only once a year and only for a handful of days. Every spring he waited anxiously for this bloom, certain that the entire worth of his year's labor rested on whether this single flower finally opened. One spring, after weeks of careful watching, the days for blooming arrived and passed, and he saw no sign of the flower at all. He searched the section of garden where it always grew, certain he had simply missed an early opening, but found only green leaves, no bloom anywhere among them. He grew increasingly distressed as the days went on. He examined the soil, wondering if something had gone wrong with the nutrients. He checked the amount of sunlight the spot received, wondering if a nearby tree had grown too tall and stolen the necessary light. He walked further and further along the garden's edges, convinced the flower must have somehow relocated itself, searching new corners and beds he rarely tended, as though the bloom might simply be hiding from him somewhere unexpected. An old woman who lived nearby, known for her own small but carefully tended garden, found him one afternoon kneeling at the far edge of his property, anxiously inspecting a bed of vegetables that had never once in their history produced his prized flower. "You look troubled," she said, settling onto a low stone wall nearby. "My flower has not bloomed," he told her. "The days have come and gone, and I have searched the entire garden. It is simply not here this year." "When did you last look behind you?" she asked. He frowned, confused by the question. "Behind me? I have been walking forward through the garden all morning, searching ahead." "That is precisely my point," she said. "You have been walking forward the entire time, searching ahead of your own steps. When did you last turn around to look at the ground you have already covered?" He considered this, somewhat embarrassed to realize he could not remember doing so at any point that morning, or indeed for several days of searching before it. He turned, finally, and looked back along the path he had walked, back toward the original bed where the flower always bloomed, the bed he had examined first and then abandoned in his growing anxiety to search further afield. There, pale and fragrant exactly as it always was, the flower had opened. It had likely opened, he realized with a sinking feeling, sometime that very morning, perhaps even while he was anxiously searching the vegetable beds at the far edge of his property, looking everywhere except the place where it had always reliably chosen to appear. "It bloomed," he said, his voice caught somewhere between relief and disbelief. "It bloomed exactly where it always does. I simply was not looking there when it happened, because I had already convinced myself it would not." "That is often how it goes," the old woman said. "Once a person becomes convinced something is missing, they tend to search increasingly unlikely places for it, growing further and further from where it was actually waiting, simply because the place it was waiting in has already been marked in the anxious mind as a place already checked and found empty." "But I checked it first," he said. "I looked there before I looked anywhere else." "You looked there before it had bloomed," she said, "and then you stopped looking there, assuming that an early empty glance settled the matter for the rest of the season. But blooming is not a single event you can verify once and then trust forever after. It requires returning again and again with fresh eyes each time, rather than relying on the verdict of your first anxious glance." He sat with this for a long while, looking at the flower, allowing himself finally simply to enjoy it rather than immediately analyzing how he had nearly missed it. "I wonder," he said slowly, "how many other things in my life I have decided are missing after one early disappointed glance, without ever turning back to check again later with fresh attention. That," the old woman said, smiling, "is usually the better question to carry away from a morning like this one. The flower will bloom again next year, and the year after, and you will likely face this same anxious morning many more times before you fully learn to trust it. But each time, if you remember to turn around, you may find the bloom has already arrived quietly in the very place you stopped looking." "Tell me," he asked the old woman before she left that afternoon, "does this happen in your own garden as well? Do you find yourself searching ahead, missing what has already arrived behind you?" She laughed, a warm, unhurried sound. "More often than I would like to admit, even after many more years of tending a garden than you have had. The habit does not disappear simply because a person understands it. It only becomes a little easier to catch, a little sooner, each time it returns." "That is not entirely comforting," he said. "It was not meant to be entirely comforting," she said. "It was meant to be entirely honest. Comfort, in my experience, tends to follow honesty rather than the other way around. Then what do you do when you catch yourself searching too far ahead? I turn around, she said simply. That is the whole of it. I do not scold myself for having wandered. I simply turn and look at what is actually behind me and trust that whatever has bloomed there will still be blooming when I arrive, since flowers, in my experience, are rarely in as much of a hurry as the anxious mind imagines them to be. He tended that garden for the rest of his life, and in later years, whenever the anxious feeling arose each spring that the flower had somehow failed to appear, he made himself pause, turn, and look back along the path he had already walked before searching any further afield. More often than not, he found it exactly there, having bloomed quietly while his attention had wandered elsewhere, patient and unhurried, asking nothing of him but the willingness eventually to turn around and see. He taught this same small practice to his own children as they grew, and later to their children, walking them through the garden each spring, asking them gently, whenever they grew anxious about some bloom not yet sighted, to simply turn around first, before walking any further ahead in search of it. In Norse mythology, there is a similar understanding, carried in the image of Yggdrasil, the great tree whose roots and branches connect all realms of existence simultaneously, suggesting that wholeness is not something assembled gradually through travel between separate worlds, but something already structurally present, holding everything together at once, requiring only recognition rather than construction. The well at the base of this tree, tended by the Norns who weave fate itself, is described as a source that does not need to be searched for elsewhere, since it already nourishes the roots of everything that exists. There is also a teaching within Norse wisdom literature found in verses attributed to Odin himself, advising that a person should not seek wisdom too restlessly in every distant hall, since the wisest counsel is often sitting quietly nearby, overlooked simply because it does not announce itself loudly enough to compete with the appeal of a longer, more impressive journey. Both ideas mirror the gardener's discovery precisely. The bloom he sought through anxious searching across unfamiliar corners of his garden had already arrived, quietly, in the very bed where it had always grown, waiting only for him to turn back and notice it. You may carry your own version of the gardener's anxious search, convinced after one disappointing glance at your own life that some essential bloom has failed to appear this season, whether that bloom looks like recognition at work, warmth in a relationship, or simply a sense of having grown in some way you can point to. Examined again, with fresh attention rather than the verdict of an earlier anxious glance, you may find more has already opened than you initially believed. Tonight, rather than searching new corners of your life for proof that something essential is missing, turn back and look gently at the ground you have already covered. You may find, the way the gardener did, that what you feared had failed to bloom this season has, in fact, already opened quietly, somewhere just behind you, while your attention was busy elsewhere, anxious and searching, certain that an early glance had already settled the matter. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a breath. Notice how you are feeling right now, not how you think you should feel, just how you actually feel. And whenever you are ready, we will continue together. Tonight we began with the quiet teaching that nothing essential is missing. And over these 13 chapters, we let that question open slowly from many different sides. We sat with a merchant who traveled 3 countries for a jewel, only to find an empty room at home finally worth opening. We sat with a young monk handed back the very breath he had walked months to recover. We sat with a woman who searched ashore for a ring resting on her own hand. We sat with a farmer, convinced his neighbour's barn was fuller, until an honest measure showed otherwise. We sat with a musician who finally heard the fullness already present in the silence before she played. We sat with a painter chasing a colour she had already mixed and forgotten. We sat with a king whose scouts learned that every distant kingdom carried its own trouble, none more complete than his own. We sat with a child, certain her wooden bird was lost, while her own closed hand held it the entire time. We sat with a sailor who found home eventually in the very port he had departed from. We sat with a weaver who discovered her ache belonged to grief, not to any missing thread. We sat with a scholar who found his answer already written in his own earliest hand. We sat with a traveller who learned that a rival had been visiting him all along, and we sat with a gardener who found his missing bloom already open, quietly behind him. We are not always missing the thing we believe we are missing. We are, more often, simply looking past it. We are not incomplete people waiting for some future arrangement of circumstances to complete us. We are complete people who have temporarily forgotten how to notice it. We are not behind in some race toward a finish line called enough. We are already standing on ground that has always been sufficient, season after season, whether or not we have remembered to look at it lately. We are not separate from the fullness we keep searching for elsewhere. We are, and always have been, woven into it, the way the weaver's thread was always woven into her own cloth, the way the sailor's home was always the shore he started from. The central thesis we have circled all night is simple. Though simple has never meant easy to live inside. Nothing essential is missing from this moment. The ache of lack we carry is not an accurate report of our circumstances. It is a habit of attention, trained by comparison, by striving, by the old conviction that fulfillment must always wait somewhere further down the road. Lao Tzu pointed, again and again, toward a quieter possibility, that the searching itself is what keeps the sought-after thing just out of view, the way a held breath cannot also be released, the way a closed fist cannot also receive. This is not a teaching mastered once and kept forever. It is returned to, again and again, every time the old restlessness rises and convinces us, briefly, that something essential has slipped away. The merchant likely felt that old pull again, some later evening. The gardener likely walked too far ahead again, some future spring, before remembering to turn around. This is not failure. It is simply the practice, forgetting, and then gently remembering again, a little sooner each time. You do not need to remember everything you heard tonight. If one moment stayed with you, One phrase, one feeling, let that be enough. Wherever you are right now, you are welcome here, exactly as you are, with whatever you are carrying and whatever you are ready to set down. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at the Tao at Night.